The morning air in the Ardennes was thick with exhaust fumes and the acrid smell of burning fuel when Oberst Friedrich von Manstein first laid eyes on the American fuel depot near Hansfeld. December 21st, 1944. The snow crunched under his jackboots as he walked between the massive steel drums, each one stenciled with U.S. Army markings. 50,000 gallons. The number rolled around in his mind like a prayer answered. His 21st Panzer Division had been running on fumes for 3 days, reduced to siphoning gasoline from abandoned American jeeps and half-tracks scattered across the Belgian countryside. But as von Manstein stood there in the pre-dawn darkness, counting barrel after barrel of high-octane American gasoline, something cold settled in his stomach. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was a dawning horror that would haunt him for the rest of his abbreviated life. This wasn't salvation. This was evidence of something far more terrifying than any Tiger tank or 88mm gun the Americans had thrown at them. This was proof of an industrial capacity so vast, so incomprehensible, that Germany had never stood a chance. Von Manstein had been a career officer since 1921. He had served in the Polish campaign, watched the Panzer Divisions slice through France like a hot knife through butter, participated in the early victories against the Soviets when it seemed the Third Reich would indeed last 1,000 years. But standing in that fuel depot, doing the mathematics in his head, he realized they had been fighting not just the American army, but the entire American continent. The fuel depot contained 50,000 gallons of gasoline. To von Manstein's quartermaster-trained mind, this represented perhaps 2 days of operations for his depleted division. 2 days if they were conservative. The Americans had simply abandoned it. Not destroyed it, not evacuated it with desperate efficiency like the German forces did when retreating. They had simply left it behind, the way a millionaire might leave small change on a dresser. His aide-de-camp, Major Wilhelm Dietrich, approached through the morning mist, his breath visible in the frigid air. Herr Oberst, the engineers have finished their inspection. The fuel is high-grade, suitable for all our vehicles. The depot also contained lubricants, antifreeze, and diesel fuel. Perhaps another 20,000 gallons total.
Von Manstein nodded absently.
70,000 gallons total. His division's daily fuel consumption, when at full strength, was approximately 15,000 gallons per day. This depot represented less than 5 days of operations for a single division. And the Americans had abandoned it without a second thought. Major, von Manstein said quietly, how many similar depots do you estimate the Americans have established between here and the Channel coast? Dietrich consulted his reconnaissance reports. Intelligence suggests at least 40 major fuel depots between Aachen and Antwerp, sir. Some considerably larger than this 1 inch. 40 depots. Von Manstein's mind began working through the implications. If each depot contained an average of 50,000 gallons, a conservative estimate, that represented 2 million gallons of fuel stockpiled for American operations. Just in this sector. Just for current operations. But then he remembered something that made his blood run cold. 3 days earlier, during their advance through Stavelot, his reconnaissance units had reported American forces deliberately destroying their own fuel dumps rather than let them fall into German hands. The Americans had set fire to over 3 million gallons of gasoline in a single afternoon. They had destroyed more fuel in one act of denial than Germany had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's masterstroke, the operation that was supposed to split the Anglo-American alliance and force a separate peace in the West, had been allocated exactly 4.8 million gallons of fuel. The OKW had scraped together every drop they could find, emptying strategic reserves, diverting fuel from training operations, even siphoning aviation gasoline from the Luftwaffe. For 0.8 million gallons to fuel 3 panzer armies for what they hoped would be a breakthrough to Antwerp. The Americans had casually burned away more than half that amount to deny it to the enemy. It was like watching someone use banknotes to light cigars. Major Dietrich was still speaking, but von Manstein barely heard him. His mind was racing through calculations, through implications, through a terrible arithmetic that spelled out Germany's doom in numbers that could not lie. Sir, should we begin moving the fuel to our forward positions? Von Manstein turned to look at his aide. Major Dietrich was 27 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, decorated for valor at Kursk. Like most of the younger officers, he still believed in the possibility of victory, still thought that superior German fighting spirit and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage. Von Manstein had believed the same thing until this morning. "Yes, Major. See to it immediately, and send a message to division headquarters. Tell them we have secured sufficient fuel for continued operations." As Dietrich hurried away to organize the fuel convoy, von Manstein remained standing among the barrels. He pulled out a small notebook and began making calculations. The kind of calculations that a staff officer learns but hopes never to use. The kind that reveal the terrible mathematics of industrial war. Germany's total oil production in 1944, including synthetic fuel from coal, imports from Romania, and domestic crude oil, had amounted to approximately 92 million barrels. That sounded impressive until you converted it to daily production. Roughly 250,000 barrels per day for the entire German war machine. The United States, according to intelligence reports that von Manstein had access to at division level, was producing 4.7 million barrels per day. Every single day, the Americans were producing more oil in a week than Germany produced in a month. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. The most terrifying part was what the Americans were doing with that oil. According to captured documents and prisoner interrogations, the U.S. Army was consuming 641,800 barrels of oil per day. Just the Army. The Navy was consuming 680,000 barrels per day. Combined, the American military forces were consuming more oil every day than Germany produced every week. And they were doing it while simultaneously supplying their allies. The British, the Soviets, the Free French, even the smaller allied nations were being supplied with American fuel. The United States was not just fighting a global war. It was fueling a global war. Von Manstein closed his notebook and looked around the fuel depot one more time. In the growing daylight, he could see that this wasn't just a collection of barrels hastily assembled. This was infrastructure, professional industrial infrastructure. The fuel had been delivered through a pipeline system, a permanent pipeline system that stretched across hundreds of miles of territory. The Americans had built pipelines to supply their forward positions. Germany was using horse-drawn carts to deliver fuel to the front lines because they didn't have enough trucks. And when they did have trucks, they didn't have enough fuel to run them. But the Americans had built permanent infrastructure to ensure their forces never ran short of fuel. The pipeline system itself told the story of American industrial capacity. According to intelligence reports, the Americans had built over 11,000 miles of new pipeline during the war. They had built more pipeline infrastructure during 3 years of war than Germany had built during the entire 20th century. And the pipelines were not the only infrastructure marvel. The fuel depot where von Manstein stood was one link in a supply chain that stretched back across the Atlantic Ocean to American refineries that were themselves marvels of industrial engineering. American refineries were producing 514,000 barrels per day of 100-octane aviation gasoline by 1945. Germany's total aviation gasoline production had dropped to less than 1,000 barrels per day by late 1944. The Americans were producing more aviation gasoline in a single day than Germany produced in 2 years. Major Dietrich returned with a convoy of half-tracks and trucks to begin moving the fuel. As the German soldiers began the laborious process of loading the barrels, von Manstein watched them work and tried to calculate how long this windfall would sustain their operations. His division, at current strength, needed approximately 8,000 gallons per day. The 50,000 gallons they had captured would last 6 days. 6 days of combat operations, assuming no major tank battles, no extended movements, no wastage. But what happened after 6 days? Where would the next fuel come from? The logistics chain from Germany was already stretched to breaking point. Fuel convoys were being attacked by Allied aircraft during daylight hours and had to move only at night, which doubled or tripled transport times. Many convoys never reached their destinations at all. The brutal mathematics of fuel consumption in mechanized warfare were inescapable. A Panzer IV tank had a range of approximately 200 kilometers on a full tank of fuel. But in combat conditions, with constant maneuvering, frequent engine starts and stops, and operation of electrical systems, that range dropped to perhaps 100 kilometers. A Tiger tank consumed even more fuel and had even shorter range. To maintain a Panzer Division in active combat required a constant flow of fuel trucks. Each fuel truck carried perhaps 2,000 gallons of gasoline, enough to refuel maybe 30 tanks once. And those fuel trucks themselves consumed fuel to deliver their cargo. The fuel trucks needed to be escorted by combat vehicles which consumed more fuel. The entire system was a constant drain on resources that Germany simply did not possess. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have solved the fuel supply problem through sheer abundance. They had so much fuel that they could afford to abandon major depots rather than defend them. They had so much fuel that they could destroy millions of gallons to deny it to the enemy. They had so much fuel that their logistics officers apparently never had to make the kind of agonizing calculations that kept von Manstein awake at night. As the last of the fuel barrels were loaded onto German trucks, von Manstein walked back toward his command vehicle. He had a report to write for Army Group headquarters. A routine report about captured enemy supplies. But how could he write about what he had really discovered in that fuel depot? How could he explain to his superiors that they weren't just losing a battle or even a campaign? They were losing a war that had been decided not by superior tactics or fighting spirit, but by industrial capacity and resource abundance that Germany could never match. The irony was that von Manstein had always understood the importance of logistics. Every professional officer did. But understanding the importance of logistics was different from grasping the full implications of industrial war between nations with vastly different productive capacities. Germany had entered the war with what seemed like a reasonable strategy. Achieve quick victories through superior tactics and training, force early peace settlements, avoid prolonged conflicts that would favor nations with larger industrial bases. The strategy had worked against Poland. It had worked against France. It had nearly worked against the Soviet Union. But it had never been tested against an opponent like the United States. An opponent that could not only match German industrial output but could exceed it by factors of 10 or 20. An opponent that could afford to be wasteful with resources because those resources were so abundant. Standing in that fuel depot, von Manstein realized that German strategy had been based on a fundamental miscalculation. They had assumed that all industrialized nations were roughly similar in their productive capacity. They had assumed that the United States, despite its size, would face the same resource constraints that Germany faced. They had been catastrophically wrong. The United States was not just another industrialized nation. It was an industrial continent. It possessed natural resources, oil, coal, iron or copper, aluminum, in quantities that Germany could barely comprehend. It possessed manufacturing capacity that had been built up over decades of peacetime growth and was now being converted to wartime production with ruthless efficiency. Most importantly, the United States possessed something that Germany had lost somewhere between the Polish campaign and the battle for Moscow: the ability to learn from its mistakes and adapt its strategy. American forces in 1944 bore little resemblance to American forces in 1941. They had learned from their early defeats, incorporated new technologies, developed new tactics, and built the industrial infrastructure to support sustained global warfare. Germany, by contrast, was still trying to win the war with the same basic strategy and largely the same equipment that had served them in 1939. They had improved their tactics and gained combat experience, but they had not fundamentally adapted to the realities of industrial warfare against opponents with superior resources. The fuel depot was evidence of American adaptability. It represented not just abundant resources, but intelligent application of those resources. The Americans had identified fuel supply as a critical vulnerability in mechanized warfare and had solved the problem through massive investment in infrastructure. They had built the pipelines, the refineries, the transport systems, and the storage facilities necessary to ensure that their forces never ran short of fuel. Germany had identified the same problem but had never been able to solve it. German forces had been plagued by fuel shortages since the early days of the Eastern Front. The deeper German forces penetrated into Soviet territory, the more difficult it became to supply them with fuel. The same pattern had repeated in North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had been defeated as much by fuel shortages as by British tactics. And now, in the Ardennes, the pattern was repeating again. German forces had achieved initial surprise and tactical success, but they were already running up against the same logistical constraints that had plagued every German offensive since 1941. The difference was that this time von Manstein could see exactly what they were fighting against. The abandoned American fuel depot was like a window into an industrial capacity that Germany could never match. As his command vehicle moved through the Belgian countryside, von Manstein tried to imagine what American war production looked like. He had seen intelligence reports about American aircraft factories that could produce a bomber every hour. He had heard about shipyards that could launch a Liberty ship every day. But it was difficult to visualize such scale until you saw its results on the battlefield. 50,000 gallons of high-grade gasoline, abandoned without a second thought. That was the result of American war production. That was what it looked like when an entire continent was mobilized for war. The Americans had converted their automobile industry to tank production and were turning out thousands of Sherman tanks every month. They had built aircraft factories that were producing tens of thousands of fighters and bombers per year. They had constructed shipyards that were launching more tonnage every month than Germany produced in a year. But most importantly, they had built the infrastructure to supply all of these weapons with fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and everything else necessary for sustained combat operations. They had solved the logistics problem that was slowly strangling the German war effort. Von Manstein's driver, Feldwebel Hans Müller, was navigating around a destroyed American supply convoy. The convoy had been caught by German artillery the previous day, and the road was littered with burned-out trucks and scattered supplies. But even this scene of destruction told the story of American abundance. The convoy had been carrying not just fuel and ammunition, but luxury items that German soldiers hadn't seen in years. Chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, medical supplies, warm clothing. American soldiers were not just better supplied than German soldiers. They were supplied with things that German soldiers considered unimaginable luxuries. The difference in supply levels was so stark that it affected combat effectiveness. Well-fed, warm, properly equipped soldiers simply fought better than hungry, cold, poorly equipped soldiers, regardless of training or motivation. Herr Oberst, Müller said, breaking von Manstein's reverie. Radio message from division headquarters. General Becker wants an immediate report on captured supplies and fuel status. Von Manstein picked up the radio handset. General Karl Becker was a competent division commander, but like most senior officers, he was focused on immediate tactical concerns. He would want to know about the fuel depot in terms of how it affected current operations, not what it revealed about the strategic situation. Division headquarters, this is von Manstein. We have secured approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline and 20,000 gallons of other petroleum products from enemy depot, sufficient for 5 to 6 days of operations at current consumption levels. Excellent news, Oberst. Can you hold the depot area and continue utilizing it as a supply point? Von Manstein looked around at the Belgian countryside. American artillery was already beginning to range in on their positions. Allied aircraft would be returning with the dawn. The depot might be useful for another few hours, but it was not defensible as a permanent supply point. Negative, sir. Enemy pressure is increasing. We are moving the fuel to forward positions and will have to abandon the depot site. Understood. Continue mission as planned. Division headquarters out. Von Manstein handed the radio back to his operator and returned to his calculations. Continue mission as planned. But what was the plan, really? The Ardennes offensive had been sold to the German High Command as Germany's last chance to change the trajectory of the war. Achieve a breakthrough to Antwerp, split the Anglo-American alliance, force a negotiated settlement in the West so that Germany could concentrate all its resources against the Soviet Union. But the plan had always been based on optimistic assumptions about fuel availability, enemy resistance, and the speed of advance. Even before the offensive began, professional staff officers had privately expressed doubts about whether the allocated resources were sufficient for the assigned mission. Now, 3 days into the operation, those doubts were proving to be well-founded. German forces had achieved some tactical successes, but they were nowhere near the ambitious objectives set by OKW. They were already facing fuel shortages, and the weather was improving, which meant that Allied air power would soon dominate the battlefield. Most critically, the Americans were not behaving like a defeated army. They were not panicking. They were not collapsing. They were adapting to German tactics and bringing their superior resources to bear in a methodical, professional manner. The fuel depot was evidence of American professionalism. It had been sited correctly for logistical efficiency. It had been protected adequately against air attack. It had been supplied regularly and maintained properly. When forced to abandon it, American forces had made the professional decision to deny it to the enemy rather than attempt a futile defense. Everything about the depot suggested that American logistics officers knew what they were doing. They understood mechanized warfare. They understood the fuel requirements of armored operations. They had built the infrastructure and supply systems necessary to support sustained combat operations in a way that Germany had never been able to match. The mathematical implications were devastating. If the United States could afford to abandon 50,000 gallons of fuel without significantly affecting their operations, then their total fuel reserves and production capacity were orders of magnitude larger than Germany's. If they could destroy 3 million gallons of fuel to deny it to the enemy, then their supply situation was so abundant that such losses were acceptable. Von Manstein tried to imagine German forces destroying 3 million gallons of fuel to deny it to an advancing enemy. It was inconceivable. 3 million gallons represented nearly a month of fuel production for the entire German war machine. No German commander would ever authorize such destruction unless the alternative was immediate and total defeat. But the Americans had made that decision casually, as a routine part of tactical withdrawal. The fuel they destroyed in one afternoon was more than Germany could produce in 3 weeks. And they had done it without apparent concern about the strategic implications. The disparity in resources was so vast that it called into question every assumption underlying German strategy. Germany had entered the war believing that superior training, equipment, and tactics could overcome numerical disadvantages. That had proved true against smaller European nations with limited industrial capacity. But it was proving false against an opponent that could match German military professionalism while bringing vastly superior resources to bear. As von Manstein's vehicle approached the forward command post, he could hear the distant rumble of American artillery. The Americans were already beginning their counterattack, bringing up fresh troops and new equipment to contain the German advance. Within hours, the sky would be filled with Allied fighter bombers, attacking any German vehicle that moved during daylight hours. The pattern was always the same. German forces would achieve initial tactical success through superior training and aggressive tactics. But then Allied forces would stabilize the situation, bring up reinforcements, and begin a methodical counteroffensive supported by overwhelming firepower and abundant supplies. The fuel depot had shown von Manstein exactly why this pattern always repeated. The Americans could afford to trade space for time because they had the resources to sustain prolonged operations. They could afford to lose equipment and supplies because they had the industrial capacity to replace losses quickly. They could afford to be patient because time was on their side in any war of attrition. Germany, by contrast, could not afford to trade anything. Every tank lost was irreplaceable. Every gallon of fuel consumed was 1 gallon fewer for future operations. Every day the war continued was a day that Germany's resource situation worsened, while America's resource situation improved. The mathematics of industrial warfare were brutal and unforgiving. Superior tactics and fighting spirit could influence individual battles, but they could not overcome fundamental disparities in productive capacity. And the disparities between Germany and the United States were not marginal differences that could be overcome through better strategy. They were categorical differences that made long-term German victory mathematically impossible. Standing in that fuel depot, von Manstein had seen the future of the war written in barrels of gasoline. Germany would continue to fight, would achieve more tactical victories, would inflict heavy casualties on Allied forces. But ultimately, Germany would be ground down by an opponent that could afford to absorb those casualties and replace those losses while Germany could not. The 50,000 gallons of captured fuel would sustain his division for perhaps a week. But what happened after that week? Where would the next fuel come from? How long could Germany continue to fight a war when every gallon of fuel consumed brought them closer to complete logistical collapse? As his vehicle pulled into the command post, von Manstein could see that other units were reporting similar fuel shortages. Radio messages were coming in from across the front reporting that German advances were slowing not because of enemy resistance, but because of fuel shortages. The great offensive that was supposed to change the course of the war was grinding to a halt for want of gasoline. The irony was complete. Germany had captured American fuel depots, but the very existence of those depots proved that America had so much fuel that such captures were meaningless. Germany was fighting for barrels of gasoline while America was swimming in an ocean of oil. The war was not being decided on the battlefield. It was being decided in American oil fields and refineries and chemical plants that German forces could never reach. It was being decided by American industrial workers who would never see combat but whose labor was just as decisive as any panzer attack. Von Manstein climbed out of his vehicle and walked toward the command post, still carrying his small notebook with its devastating calculations. He would write his report about captured supplies, and that report would make its way up the chain of command to officers who would see it as good news. 50,000 gallons of fuel captured. Objective achieved. Mission successful. But von Manstein knew better. The fuel depot had revealed not German success, but German failure. It had shown him exactly why Germany could not win this war, no matter how many tactical victories they achieved, no matter how bravely their soldiers fought, no matter how cleverly their generals maneuvered. They were not fighting the American army. They were fighting American industry, and American industry was a force that no amount of tactical brilliance could defeat. The mathematics were clear, unforgiving, and final. Germany was doomed. But the story of that doom was not written only in German fuel calculations. It was written in Japanese naval architecture, in Italian maritime logistics, in Soviet industrial planning, and in American production schedules that were themselves mathematical marvels of industrial efficiency. To understand the full implications of von Manstein's discovery, it was necessary to see the war through the eyes of commanders and planners from every nation involved in the conflict. Each brought their own perspective to the terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare, and each reached their own conclusions about what those numbers meant for the future of their nations. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, watching the sun set over the Pacific on March 15, 1943. The flagship of the combined fleet represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval architecture, a 72,000-ton monument to Japanese engineering and fighting spirit. But as Yamamoto studied the intelligence reports spread across the chart table, he felt the same cold dread that would later grip Oberst von Manstein in that Belgian fuel depot. The numbers told a story that no amount of samurai courage could change. American shipbuilding capacity was not just superior to Japanese capacity. It was superior by margins that made long-term victory mathematically impossible. Commander Takashi Fujimoto, Yamamoto's intelligence officer, had spent 3 months compiling data on American war production. The results were more devastating than any battle report. "Admiral," Fujimoto said quietly, "the latest intelligence from our agents in neutral countries confirms our worst estimates. American shipyards launched 141 warships in 1942. That includes 12 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, and 48 destroyers." Yamamoto nodded grimly. Japan had launched 23 major warships in 1942, including only 1 aircraft carrier. The Americans were outbuilding the Japanese Navy by a ratio of 6 to 1. But even that number didn't capture the full scale of American production. "What about merchant shipping, Commander?" Fujimoto consulted another set of reports. American shipyards completed 5.5 million tons of merchant shipping in 1942, sir. They are now launching Liberty ships faster than our submarines can sink them. At current rates, they will complete 8.3 million tons this year. 8.3 million tons. Yamamoto tried to visualize such numbers. That represented more shipping tonnage than Japan had built in the entire 20th century. The Americans were replacing their entire pre-war merchant fleet every 2 years while simultaneously building the largest navy in history. But merchant shipping was not the most terrifying aspect of American production. The most terrifying aspect was aircraft production. Tell me about aircraft production, Commander. American aircraft factories produced 47,000 aircraft in 1942, sir. Intelligence estimates suggest they will produce 100,000 aircraft this year. 100,000 aircraft. Japan was struggling to produce 12,000 aircraft per year, and many of those were training aircraft or obsolete models kept in production because newer designs required materials that were no longer available. The Americans were not just producing more aircraft. They were producing better aircraft. The new American fighters, the F-4U Corsair, the F-6F Hellcat, were superior to Japanese designs in almost every measurable category. Speed, climb rate, dive performance, firepower, armor protection. American aircraft were better designed, better built, and better equipped than Japanese aircraft. And they were powered by American engines that ran on American aviation gasoline. High-octane aviation gasoline that Japanese industry could not produce in sufficient quantities. What is the latest intelligence on American fuel production, Commander? Fujimoto's expression grew even more somber. American oil production has increased to 4.7 million barrels per day, sir. Their aviation gasoline production alone exceeds our total fuel consumption by a factor of 10 to 1. Yamamoto had spent 2 years at Harvard University in the 1920s. He had traveled across the United States and had seen American industrial capacity with his own eyes. But even he had not fully grasped the implications of that industrial capacity when applied to war production. The United States was not just winning the production war. It was winning by margins that made Japanese production seem almost irrelevant. American factories were turning out more aircraft in a month than Japan produced in 6 months. American shipyards were launching more tonnage in a week than Japanese shipyards launched in a month. Most critically, the Americans were improving their production methods even as they scaled up production. They were learning to build ships faster, aircraft cheaper, weapons more efficiently. They were applying industrial engineering principles to war production with results that Japanese industry could not match. The implications for naval strategy were devastating. Japan had entered the war with a fleet that was roughly competitive with American Pacific Fleet strength. The attack on Pearl Harbor had temporarily shifted the balance in Japan's favor. But that temporary advantage was being eroded by American production capacity that Japan could never match. Every month that passed saw American naval strength increase while Japanese naval strength remained static or declined. Every Japanese warship sunk was effectively irreplaceable. Every American warship sunk was replaced by 2 or 3 new vessels within months. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the Americans so overwhelmingly that Japanese strategy had to be reconsidered from first principles. Japan could not afford to fight a prolonged war of attrition. Japanese strategy had to achieve decisive results quickly, or it would fail as surely as night followed day. But decisive results were becoming increasingly difficult to achieve. American defensive capabilities were improving as rapidly as their offensive capabilities. American radar technology was superior to Japanese radar technology. American communications equipment was superior to Japanese communications equipment. American damage control procedures were superior to Japanese damage control procedures. The Americans were not just building more ships. They were building better ships equipped with superior technology and manned by crews that were better trained and better supplied than Japanese crews. Yamamoto walked to the bridge wing and looked out over the combined fleet anchorage. Dozens of warships lay at anchor, representing the accumulated naval construction of decades. The sight should have been reassuring. Instead, it filled him with foreboding. This fleet represented the maximum strength that Japanese industry could sustain. Every ship present had been built at the expense of enormous effort and sacrifice by the Japanese people. Many of these ships would never be replaced if lost in combat. The American Pacific Fleet was growing larger every month, equipped with newer and better technology, supplied with abundant fuel and ammunition and spare parts. American naval aviators were receiving 350 hours of flight training before being assigned to combat units. Japanese pilots were receiving less than 100 hours of training because Japan could not afford to waste fuel on extended training programs. The fuel shortage was particularly critical for naval aviation. Aircraft carriers were useless without aviation gasoline, and Japan's ability to produce high-octane aviation gasoline was severely limited. Japanese synthetic fuel plants could not match the quantity or quality of American fuel production. Commander Fujimoto approached with another intelligence report. "Admiral, we have received confirmation of American aircraft carrier construction schedules. They will commission 8 new fleet carriers this year and 14 escort carriers. By the end of 1943, the U.S. Navy will operate more aircraft carriers than Japan has ever possessed." Yamamoto studied the intelligence report. American carrier construction was proceeding on multiple parallel tracks. Large fleet carriers that were superior to Japanese designs. Escort carriers that could be produced quickly for convoy protection and amphibious support. Light carriers converted from cruiser hulls to accelerate delivery schedules. The Americans had apparently solved the engineering and logistical challenges of carrier construction so thoroughly that they could mass-produce aircraft carriers like merchant ships. Japanese industry, by contrast, was struggling to complete even a few carriers using construction methods that had barely changed since the 1920s. The disparity in construction methods reflected a deeper disparity in industrial capabilities. American shipyards used electric welding, modular construction, and assembly line techniques that dramatically reduced construction time and labor requirements. Japanese shipyards still relied heavily on traditional riveting and hand-fitting techniques that required skilled craftsmen and extended construction schedules. American industry had been transformed by decades of mass production experience in the automobile and appliance industries. Those same techniques were now being applied to warship construction with devastating effectiveness. Japanese industry had never developed mass production capabilities on a comparable scale and could not quickly adapt to American construction methods. The result was that American shipbuilders could produce a destroyer in 6 months while Japanese shipbuilders required 18 months for comparable vessels. American aircraft factories could produce a fighter in 1 week while Japanese aircraft factories required 1 month. American industrial efficiency was not just superior, it was superior by factors that made competition impossible. Yamamoto returned to his cabin and sat down at his desk to write his daily report to Naval General Staff Headquarters. How could he explain to his superiors that Japan was losing a war that could not be won through superior tactics or fighting spirit? How could he convey the implications of American production statistics that most Japanese officers could not even comprehend? The tragedy was that Yamamoto had understood these implications from the beginning. His study of American industrial capacity during his time in the United States had convinced him that Japan could not win a prolonged war against America. He had supported the attack on Pearl Harbor not because he believed Japan could achieve ultimate victory, but because he believed Japan's only chance lay in achieving early decisive results that might force American acceptance of a negotiated settlement. But the attack on Pearl Harbor, while tactically successful, had not achieved the strategic objective of forcing America out of the war. Instead, it had ensured American entry into the war and had given American industry the motivation and political support necessary for total mobilization. The result was exactly what Yamamoto had feared: a prolonged war of attrition between opponents with vastly different industrial capabilities. Japan was fighting with the industrial resources of a few isolated islands. America was fighting with the industrial resources of an entire continent. The mathematical outcome was predetermined. Japan could achieve tactical victories, could inflict heavy casualties on American forces, could delay American advances. But ultimately, Japan would be overwhelmed by American production capacity that Japan could never match. The irony was that many Japanese officers continued to believe in the possibility of victory through superior fighting spirit and tactical excellence. They had not seen American production facilities, had not studied American industrial statistics, had not grasped the full implications of mechanized warfare between opponents with different resource bases. Yamamoto had seen those production facilities. He had studied those statistics. He understood those implications. And he knew that Japan was doomed unless American political will collapsed before American industrial capacity reached full mobilization. But American political will was not collapsing. American industrial capacity was reaching unprecedented levels of production. and American military performance was improving with each engagement as American forces gained combat experience and incorporated superior technology. The mathematics of the Pacific War were as clear and unforgiving as the mathematics that would later confront von Manstein in that Belgian fuel depot. Superior industrial capacity, properly applied, would ultimately prevail over superior tactics and fighting spirit. The tragedy was not that Japan would lose the war. The tragedy was that Japanese strategy had never acknowledged the mathematical reality of industrial warfare. Japanese planning had been based on assumptions about American weakness and Japanese superiority that bore no relationship to measurable facts. Yamamoto finished his report and walked back to the bridge. The combined fleet represented the maximum effort of Japanese naval construction. It was a formidable force by any standard, but it was also a finite force that could not be replaced once lost in combat. The American Pacific Fleet was growing larger and stronger every month, supported by an industrial base that seemed capable of unlimited expansion. Within 2 years, American naval strength in the Pacific would exceed Japanese naval strength by ratios that would make further resistance futile. The mathematics were clear, and the mathematics were final. Japan, like Germany, was doomed by the terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare. General Ettore Bastico stood in the operations room of the Italian Army headquarters in Rome, studying reports from North Africa with growing despair. The date was September 8, 1942, and the news from the Western Desert was uniformly grim. Not because of battlefield defeats. The Afrika Korps and Italian forces were still holding their positions at El Alamein, but because of something more prosaic and ultimately more decisive: fuel shortages. The reports on Bastico's desk told a story of logistical failure that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Italian merchant shipping was being sunk faster than it could be replaced. German and Italian forces in North Africa were consuming fuel faster than it could be delivered. The mathematics of Mediterranean warfare were turning inexorably against the Axis powers. Colonel Enrico Martelli, Bastico's chief logistics officer, entered the room carrying the latest shipping reports. "General, I have the figures for August shipping operations." Bastico looked up from the maps. Colonel Martelli had been compiling these reports for 18 months, and each month the numbers grew worse. The British Royal Navy and Royal Air Force, operating primarily from Malta, were methodically destroying the Italian merchant fleet that supplied Axis forces in North Africa. "How bad is it this month, Colonel?" "Worse than July, sir. We attempted to deliver 72,000 tons of supplies to North Africa. Only 32,000 tons arrived at destination. The remainder was either sunk en route or had to be diverted to alternative ports due to enemy action. 32,000 tons delivered out of 72,000 tons attempted. The Axis supply situation in North Africa was approaching complete breakdown. Field Marshal Rommel had been requesting a minimum of 70,000 tons per month to sustain offensive operations. He was receiving less than half that amount, and much of what did arrive consisted of ammunition and spare parts rather than the fuel that was most desperately needed. "What about fuel specifically, Colonel?" Martelli consulted his detailed records. "Fuel deliveries in August totaled 11,500 tons. Sir, General Rommel has requested 23,000 tons per month as the minimum requirement for sustained operations. 23,000 tons requested, 11,500 tons delivered. The Afrika Korps was receiving exactly half the fuel it needed for offensive operations, and even that reduced amount was arriving irregularly and at enormous cost in shipping losses. The fuel shortage was not merely a matter of logistics efficiency. It was a matter of industrial capacity and resource availability that exposed the fundamental weaknesses of Axis strategy in the Mediterranean theater. Italy's domestic oil production was negligible. Italian synthetic fuel production was limited to a few small plants that could not begin to supply military requirements. Italian fuel supplies depended almost entirely on imports, either from Romanian oil fields or from Soviet oil fields accessible through German-controlled territory. But transporting fuel from Romania or Soviet territory to Italian ports, then from Italian ports to North African destinations, required shipping capacity that Italy simply did not possess. The Italian merchant fleet had been adequate for peacetime trade, but it was completely inadequate for sustaining military operations across the Mediterranean while under constant attack by British forces. The British, by contrast, had solved their fuel supply problems through control of Middle Eastern oil fields. British forces in North Africa were supplied through a pipeline from Iraqi oil fields to Mediterranean ports. They had virtually unlimited fuel supplies and did not need to risk merchant shipping to maintain their fuel stocks. The strategic implications were devastating. British forces could afford to be wasteful with fuel because their supply situation was secure. They could maintain large armored formations in constant readiness, could conduct extensive reconnaissance operations, could support their forces with abundant air cover that required enormous quantities of aviation gasoline. Axis forces had to conserve fuel like a precious commodity. German tank commanders were required to shut down their engines whenever possible to save fuel. Italian forces were forbidden to conduct training exercises that consumed significant quantities of gasoline. The Luftwaffe was reduced to flying only essential missions because aviation gasoline was in such short supply. The fuel shortage affected not only current operations but also strategic planning. Rommel's tactical brilliance was constrained by logistics realities that limited his freedom of action. He could not pursue retreating British forces because he lacked fuel for extended pursuit operations. He could not maintain large reserves in mobile positions because fuel shortages forced him to keep most vehicles stationary. Most critically, the fuel shortage meant that Axis strategy in North Africa had to achieve quick, decisive results or face inevitable defeat. Prolonged operations favored the British because they had secure supply lines while Axis supply lines were under constant attack. Colonel Martelli spread a chart across the map table showing Italian shipping losses over the previous 18 months. The trend line was unmistakably clear. Italian merchant shipping capacity was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. General, at current loss rates, we will not have sufficient shipping capacity to maintain even minimal supply operations to North Africa after December. The mathematics are quite clear. Bastico studied the chart. Italian shipyards were launching new merchant vessels, but not nearly fast enough to replace combat losses. British submarines, aircraft, and surface vessels were sinking Italian merchant ships faster than Italian industry could build them. The disparity in shipbuilding capacity was even more pronounced than the disparity in current shipping losses. Italian shipyards were operating at maximum capacity but could not match British and American shipbuilding output. British shipyards were launching new vessels every week. American shipyards were launching Liberty ships at a rate that defied comprehension. But the most devastating comparison was not with British production, but with German production. Germany was supposedly Italy's senior partner in the Axis alliance, but German assistance with Mediterranean logistics had been minimal. Germany was providing military units, the Afrika Korps, but was not providing the shipping capacity necessary to sustain those units in combat. The reason was simple. Germany was facing its own fuel shortages and shipping constraints. German industry was operating at maximum capacity to support operations on the Eastern Front and could not simultaneously support major operations in the Mediterranean. The Axis powers were attempting to fight a global war with resources that were barely adequate for regional conflicts. The fuel shortage in North Africa was a microcosm of broader Axis resource constraints that would ultimately determine the outcome of the war. Neither Germany nor Italy possessed the industrial capacity to sustain prolonged operations on multiple fronts against opponents with superior resources. Bastico walked to the window and looked out over Rome. The city appeared peaceful, almost normal, despite 2 years of war. But appearances were deceptive. Italian industry was straining under the demands of war production. Italian agriculture was struggling to feed the civilian population while supporting military operations. Italian transportation was breaking down under the strain of wartime demands and fuel shortages. The Mediterranean campaign was consuming resources that Italy could not afford to lose. Every Italian merchant ship sunk in the Mediterranean was a vessel that could not transport essential supplies to Italian civilians. Every ton of fuel sent to North Africa was a ton that could not be used to support Italian industry or agriculture. Italy was fighting a war that it could not afford to fight with resources that it could not afford to lose against opponents who seemed to have unlimited resources and industrial capacity. The mathematical reality was that Italy's participation in the war was hastening Italy's defeat. Italian resources would have been better preserved for defensive operations rather than being consumed in futile offensive operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean. But Italian strategy had been based on the assumption that German military success would compensate for Italian resource limitations. Italian planners had assumed that German victories in Europe would lead to quick peace settlements that would allow Italy to consolidate territorial gains without facing prolonged warfare against superior opponents. Those assumptions had proved catastrophically wrong. German military success had been insufficient to force early peace settlements. The war was becoming prolonged, exactly the type of war that favored opponents with superior industrial capacity and resource availability. Colonel Martelli interrupted Bastico's thoughts with another report. General, we have received a request from Field Marshal Rommel for immediate delivery of 15,000 tons of fuel. He states that current fuel stocks will be exhausted within 1 week. 15,000 tons of fuel. That represented nearly half of Italy's total monthly fuel allocation for North African operations. Delivering such quantities would require a major convoy operation that would certainly attract British attention and would probably result in heavy shipping losses. But refusing the request would mean abandoning Axis forces in North Africa to defeat due to fuel starvation. German and Italian units would be immobilized and vulnerable to British counterattacks that they could not resist without fuel for their vehicles. What shipping capacity do we have available for such an operation, Colonel? Martelli consulted his shipping schedules. We could assemble a convoy of 8 merchant vessels with appropriate naval escort. But our intelligence indicates that British naval and air forces are concentrated around Malta specifically to intercept major convoy operations. A convoy of 8 merchant vessels would represent a substantial portion of Italy's remaining merchant shipping capacity. If the convoy were intercepted and destroyed, Italy would lose not only the fuel that Rommel desperately needed, but also the shipping capacity necessary for future supply operations. The decision represented the kind of impossible choice that confronted Axis planners throughout the war. They could risk their remaining resources in potentially futile operations, or they could abandon ongoing operations and accept strategic defeat. The choice was particularly painful because it exposed the mathematical reality of Axis strategy. Italy was being asked to risk irreplaceable shipping capacity to sustain operations that could not be sustained indefinitely regardless of current tactical results. Even if the convoy successfully delivered its cargo, even if Rommel achieved another tactical victory, the underlying resource constraints would remain unchanged. Axis forces in North Africa would continue to face fuel shortages. Italian shipping would continue to be sunk by British forces. The mathematics of Mediterranean warfare would continue to favor the Allies. Bastico made the decision that Italian commanders had been making for 18 months. Authorize the convoy operation and hope that tactical success could somehow overcome strategic resource constraints. Colonel, prepare orders for convoy operations as requested. 8 merchant vessels with maximum naval escort. Priority cargo will be fuel and ammunition as specified by Africa Corps headquarters. As Martelli left to prepare the convoy orders, Bastico returned to studying the charts and reports that covered his desk. The story they told was unambiguous. Italy was losing the Mediterranean war not because of inferior tactics or poor fighting spirit, but because of resource constraints that could not be overcome through better planning or greater effort. The British controlled Middle Eastern oil fields that provided virtually unlimited fuel supplies. The Americans were providing Britain with merchant shipping capacity that more than replaced combat losses. The combined Allied industrial capacity was sufficient to sustain prolonged operations in multiple theaters, while Axis industrial capacity was barely sufficient to sustain operations on a single front. The mathematics were clear, and the mathematics were final. Italy, like Germany and Japan, was doomed by the terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare. The convoy would sail, and it might even reach its destination successfully. Rommel might achieve another tactical victory with the fuel it delivered. But such tactical successes could not change the strategic reality that Axis resources were finite while Allied resources seemed infinite. Italy was fighting a war that could not be won through superior courage or tactical brilliance. It was fighting a war that could only be won through superior industrial capacity and resource availability. And in that contest, Italy was hopelessly outmatched. The fuel shortage in North Africa was not just a logistical problem. It was a symptom of strategic failure that no amount of tactical success could cure. Italy had committed itself to a war that its resources could not sustain, against opponents whose resources seemed limitless. The terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare was grinding inexorably toward a conclusion that no Italian general could alter. Italy would lose the war because Italy could not afford to fight the war. Dr. Heinrich Weber stood in the control room of the Luna synthetic fuel plant at 4:30 in the morning on May 12, 1944, watching pressure gauges and temperature indicators that told the story of Germany's desperate attempt to fuel a mechanized war with coal instead of oil. As the chief chemical engineer for IG Farben's synthetic fuel operations, Weber understood better than most the mathematical relationship between industrial chemistry and military strategy. What he understood on this particular morning was that American bombers were about to destroy 3 years of his life's work along with Germany's last hope of achieving fuel self-sufficiency. The Luna plant was the largest synthetic fuel facility in the world, a cathedral of industrial chemistry that covered 14 square kilometers and employed over 35,000 workers. At peak production, it could convert 4,000 tons of coal per day into 1,500 tons of synthetic gasoline, diesel fuel, and aviation fuel. It represented the pinnacle of German chemical engineering, a technological marvel that had taken 2 decades to perfect. It was also hopelessly inadequate for Germany's wartime fuel requirements, and Weber knew it. Hans Kellner, Weber's production supervisor, approached the control panel carrying the night shift production reports. Her doctor, production figures for the past 24 hours. Weber studied the reports with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 15 years optimizing chemical processes. The numbers told a familiar story. Maximum theoretical production achieved through heroic efforts by workers who were increasingly exhausted, increasingly malnourished, and increasingly aware that their efforts were not sufficient to meet Germany's fuel requirements. 1,520 tons of finished products, sir. Slightly above nominal capacity thanks to the new catalyst mixture we implemented last week. 1,520 tons per day from the world's largest synthetic fuel plant. Weber did the mental calculation automatically. 550,000 tons per year from Luna alone. It sounded impressive until you considered it in the context of Germany's total fuel consumption. Germany's military forces were consuming approximately 2 million tons of fuel per year, assuming normal operations without major offensives. The entire German synthetic fuel industry, including 24 major plants and dozens of smaller facilities, was producing approximately 1.8 million tons per year at maximum capacity. The mathematics were uncomfortably close. Germany's synthetic fuel production was barely sufficient to meet military requirements, assuming perfect efficiency, no combat losses, no interruptions to production, and no fuel allocation for civilian use. Any disruption to synthetic fuel production would create immediate shortages throughout the German war machine. And disruptions were becoming increasingly frequent. Allied bombing raids had already forced temporary shutdowns at several synthetic fuel plants. Sabotage by foreign workers was reducing production efficiency at plants that remained operational. Raw material shortages were limiting production capacity at plants that had been designed for maximum output. Most critically, the chemical processes used to convert coal into liquid fuel were enormously energy-intensive. The synthetic fuel plants consumed vast quantities of electricity, steam, and process heat. As Allied bombing disrupted German power generation and industrial infrastructure, the synthetic fuel plants found it increasingly difficult to maintain full production even when they were not directly attacked. Weber walked through the plant's main production hall, past towering distillation columns and maze-like pipe networks that represented decades of chemical engineering refinement. The Bergius process used to produce synthetic fuel was intellectually elegant but practically demanding. Coal was pulverized, mixed with heavy oil, and subjected to high temperature and pressure in the presence of hydrogen gas and special catalysts. The resulting synthetic crude oil was then refined using conventional petroleum refining techniques. The process worked, but it was inherently inefficient compared to conventional petroleum refining. It took approximately 4 tons of coal to produce 1 ton of synthetic fuel. Germany was consuming coal faster than it could be mined, even with the resources of occupied territories available to supplement domestic production. The synthetic fuel program also required enormous quantities of specialized equipment and materials that were increasingly difficult to obtain. High-pressure reactors, hydrogen compressors, specialized steel alloys, rare earth catalysts, all were in short supply and becoming more difficult to replace as the war continued. Most critically, the synthetic fuel program required skilled workers who understood complex chemical processes. But many of those workers had been drafted for military service and replaced with foreign workers who lacked both the technical knowledge and the motivation to maintain production efficiency. Weber paused at one of the main reactor units, a cylindrical steel vessel 30 meters long and 3 meters in diameter, operating at temperatures of 450 degrees Celsius and pressures of 300 atmospheres. The reactor represented the heart of the synthetic fuel process, and it was showing signs of stress after 3 years of continuous operation at maximum capacity. Herr Kellner, what is the status of reactor number 7? Kellner consulted his maintenance reports. Internal pressure monitoring indicates possible catalyst degradation, sir. Efficiency has dropped approximately 8% over the past month. We recommend shutdown for catalyst replacement, but that would reduce plant production for at least 1 week. 1 week of reduced production meant approximately 10,000 tons of synthetic fuel that would not be available to German military forces. 10,000 tons represented fuel for perhaps 50,000 vehicle kilometers of operation, enough to supply a panzer division for 2 weeks of active combat. But continuing to operate the reactor with degraded catalyst would mean permanently reduced production capacity and possible equipment failure that could shut down the entire plant for months. The decision represented the kind of impossible choice that confronted German industry throughout the war: accept short-term losses to preserve long-term capability, or maximize short-term production at the risk of catastrophic equipment failure. Weber made the decision that German engineers had been making for 2 years. Defer maintenance and maximize short-term production. Continue operation with degraded catalyst until efficiency drops below acceptable limits. Schedule replacement for next month if spare catalysts are available. The decision was strategically rational but tactically dangerous. German synthetic fuel production was so close to military requirements that any reduction in production would create immediate shortages. But continuing to operate equipment beyond recommended maintenance intervals virtually guaranteed eventual equipment failures that would cause far greater production losses. The synthetic fuel program had been conceived as Germany's answer to the resource constraints that limited German military operations. German chemical companies, led by IG Farben, had developed the technology to convert Germany's abundant coal reserves into liquid fuel that could power aircraft, tanks, and naval vessels. The technology worked, but it had never been tested under the conditions of total war against opponents with virtually unlimited petroleum resources. The synthetic fuel program could supplement German fuel supplies, but it could not replace petroleum imports entirely. And petroleum imports had been virtually eliminated by Allied naval and air superiority. Weber continued his inspection tour, moving through the plant's aviation gasoline section. Aviation gasoline production was the most technically demanding aspect of synthetic fuel manufacturing, requiring additional chemical processing to achieve the octane ratings needed for high-performance aircraft engines. The aviation gasoline section was operating at maximum capacity, producing approximately 200 tons per day of 100-octane aviation gasoline. That was enough fuel for perhaps 500 fighter aircraft sorties, assuming standard fuel consumption rates. But the Luftwaffe was attempting to maintain 3,000 operational aircraft, each requiring fuel for training flights, combat operations, and operational readiness. The mathematics of aviation fuel consumption were particularly unforgiving. A single fighter aircraft consumed approximately 500 liters of fuel per hour of operation. A bomber consumed 2,000 liters per hour. Training a single fighter pilot required approximately 40,000 liters of fuel for the minimum 100-hour training program. The Luftwaffe had been forced to reduce pilot training from 300 hours to 100 hours primarily because of fuel shortages. German pilots were entering combat with 1/3 the flight experience of their Allied counterparts, and the difference in combat effectiveness was measurable in casualty statistics that grew worse each month. Weber reached the plant's control center, where production data from all 24 synthetic fuel plants was collected and analyzed. The numbers told a story of industrial achievement and strategic failure. German chemical engineering had successfully converted coal into fuel on an unprecedented scale, but that scale was still insufficient for Germany's military requirements. Herr Kellner, what are the latest production figures for the entire synthetic fuel program? Kellner consulted reports from IG Farben headquarters. Combined production from all plants is currently running at 4,900 tons per day. Sir, that represents 96% of theoretical maximum capacity. 4,900 tons per day. 1.8 million tons per year. Weber performed the same calculation he had been performing for 18 months. Synthetic fuel production was approximately 90% of minimum military requirements, assuming no combat losses, no fuel allocation for civilian use, and no disruptions to production. But combat losses were increasing as German forces faced opponents with superior equipment and training. Civilian fuel allocation had been reduced to minimal levels but could not be eliminated entirely without collapsing German agriculture and transportation. Disruptions to production were becoming more frequent as Allied bombing intensified. The synthetic fuel program had achieved remarkable technical success but strategic failure. German chemical engineering had solved the problem of converting coal into fuel, but German industrial capacity could not solve the problem of producing fuel in quantities sufficient for global warfare against opponents with unlimited petroleum resources. Weber walked to his office and sat down at his desk to write his weekly production report for IG Farben management. How could he explain that the synthetic fuel program was both a triumph of German technology and a demonstration of German strategic limitations? The technology was genuinely impressive. German chemists had developed chemical processes that American and British chemists had failed to perfect. German engineers had built synthetic fuel plants that were larger and more efficient than comparable facilities in any other country. German workers had operated those plants at maximum capacity under increasingly difficult conditions. But technology and engineering skill could not overcome fundamental disparities in resource availability. Germany was attempting to fuel a mechanized war with synthetic fuel produced from coal. The United States was fueling a mechanized war with petroleum pumped directly from the ground at a fraction of the cost and complexity required for synthetic fuel production. The economic implications were devastating. Synthetic fuel production required massive capital investment, enormous quantities of coal, vast amounts of electricity, and thousands of skilled workers. Petroleum production required drilling wells and building pipelines, but the ongoing production costs were far lower than synthetic fuel production costs. Germany was spending perhaps 10 times as much per gallon to produce synthetic fuel as the Americans were spending to produce petroleum-based fuel. The cost differential meant that Germany could never match American fuel production even if German industrial capacity were comparable to American industrial capacity. But German industrial capacity was not comparable to American industrial capacity. American petroleum production in 1944 was approximately 4.7 million barrels per day. German synthetic fuel production was approximately 33,000 barrels per day. The Americans were producing more fuel every day than Germany produced in 4 months. The disparity was so vast that it called into question the entire strategic rationale for the synthetic fuel program. Germany had invested enormous resources in developing synthetic fuel technology, resources that might have been better spent on other aspects of war production. But the synthetic fuel program had been essential for German military operations. Without synthetic fuel, German forces would have been immobilized much earlier in the war. The program had provided Germany with the fuel necessary to conduct military operations for 4 years of global warfare. The problem was not that the synthetic fuel program had failed. The problem was that German strategy had required fuel production on a scale that no synthetic fuel program could achieve. Germany needed petroleum resources comparable to American petroleum resources, and such resources simply did not exist within German-controlled territory. Weber finished his report and walked back through the production facility. In a few hours, American bombers would begin their attack on the Luna plant. Intelligence reports suggested that the Americans had identified synthetic fuel production as a critical vulnerability in the German war effort and were concentrating their bombing efforts on synthetic fuel facilities. The attack would cause extensive damage and force a shutdown of production for at least several weeks. Similar attacks on other synthetic fuel plants would reduce German fuel production below the critical threshold necessary for military operations. The synthetic fuel program that had sustained German military operations for 4 years was about to be destroyed by opponents who had finally identified and targeted Germany's most critical industrial vulnerability. The irony was that the American bombing campaign against synthetic fuel plants was succeeding not because American technology was superior to German technology, but because American petroleum resources made synthetic fuel unnecessary. The Americans could afford to destroy German synthetic fuel plants because they had unlimited access to conventional petroleum that was cheaper and more abundant than any synthetic fuel could ever be. Weber stood in the control room one last time, looking at the instruments and gauges that monitored the chemical processes he had spent 15 years perfecting. The synthetic fuel program represented some of the most advanced chemical engineering ever attempted. It had achieved production levels that most experts had considered impossible. But it had not achieved production levels sufficient to sustain German military operations against opponents with superior petroleum resources. The terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare had defeated German chemical engineering just as it had defeated German tactical excellence and German fighting spirit. The synthetic fuel program was about to become a casualty of the same mathematical reality that had doomed von Manstein's fuel calculations and Yamamoto's naval strategy and Bastico's Mediterranean logistics. Superior industrial capacity, properly applied, would ultimately prevail over superior technology and engineering skill. At precisely 10:15 that morning, the first formations of American B-24 bombers appeared over the Luna synthetic fuel plant. Dr. Heinrich Weber watched from a reinforced bunker as 3 years of his life's work was systematically destroyed by opponents who had solved the fuel supply problem through sheer abundance rather than technical sophistication. The mathematics of industrial warfare were brutal, unforgiving, and final. James Patterson stood on the observation deck of the Ford River Rouge plant at 6:30 in the morning on January 15, 1944, watching an industrial symphony that would have been unimaginable 3 years earlier. The massive factory complex that had once produced civilian automobiles at a rate of 1 vehicle every 69 seconds was now producing B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 aircraft every 63 minutes. The transformation represented not just industrial conversion, but industrial revolution on a scale that no other nation could match. As the War Production Board's chief liaison officer for automotive industry conversion, Patterson had overseen the transformation of American automobile factories into aircraft production facilities, tank manufacturing plants, and munitions factories. The statistics he compiled told the story of American industrial capacity applied to military production with results that exceeded the most optimistic pre-war estimates. Thomas Mitchell, Ford's production manager, joined Patterson on the observation deck carrying the daily production reports that documented the mathematical miracle of American war production. Jim, yesterday's production figures from Willow Run. 18 B-24s completed and delivered to the Army Air Forces. That brings our January total to 212 aircraft with 2 weeks remaining in the month. 212 heavy bombers produced in 2 weeks by a single factory that had not existed before the war. Patterson did the calculation automatically. Ford's Willow Run plant was producing more 4-engine bombers in 1 month than Germany produced in 6 months. And Willow Run was only one of dozens of American aircraft factories that had been built or converted since 1941. The scale of American aircraft production was beyond the comprehension of foreign observers who had not witnessed the transformation of American industry. American aircraft factories had produced 47,000 aircraft in 1942, 96,000 aircraft in 1943, and were on track to produce 120,000 aircraft in 1944. 120,000 aircraft per year meant 328 aircraft per day, every day, including weekends and holidays. It meant that American factories were producing more aircraft every 3 days than Japan produced in a month. It meant that American aircraft production alone exceeded the total industrial output of most European nations. But aircraft production was only part of the story. American shipyards were launching merchant vessels at a rate that defied comprehension. American tank factories were producing armored vehicles in quantities that made individual tank battles tactically insignificant. American munitions plants were turning out artillery shells and small arms ammunition in numbers that ensured Allied forces would never face ammunition shortages. Patterson walked through the Willow Run production facility, past assembly lines where workers from Detroit's automobile industry were applying mass production techniques to aircraft manufacturing. The B-24 Liberator was not the most advanced aircraft design in the world, but it was designed for mass production using techniques pioneered in American automobile factories. Each B-24 required approximately 450,000 individual parts, all manufactured to precise tolerances and assembled using methods that minimized skilled labor requirements. Ford engineers had analyzed every aspect of B-24 construction and had redesigned production processes to maximize efficiency and minimize production time. The result was that Willow Run could produce a complete four-engine bomber in less time than most European factories required to produce a single-engine fighter. American mass production techniques were not just more efficient than European production methods. They were more efficient by factors that made competition impossible. The efficiency advantage extended beyond manufacturing processes to include raw material utilization, transportation logistics, and quality control procedures. American factories were producing better products faster while consuming fewer resources per unit of output than comparable factories in other nations. Patterson stopped at the final assembly station where completed B-24s were receiving their final inspections before delivery to Army Air Forces crews. The aircraft represented the culmination of an industrial process that had transformed raw materials from across the American continent into finished weapons of war. The aluminum in the aircraft structure came from American bauxite mines and American aluminum refineries powered by American hydroelectric dams. The steel in the landing gear came from American iron ore and American steel mills fired by American coal. The rubber in the tires came from American synthetic rubber plants that had replaced Southeast Asian natural rubber supplies cut off by Japanese conquest. Even the fuel that would power the aircraft came from American oil wells and American refineries that produced gasoline in quantities that German intelligence analysts consistently underestimated. American oil production had increased from 3.7 million barrels per day in 1940 to 4.7 million barrels per day in 1944, an increase of 1 million barrels per day in 4 years. 1 million barrels per day represented more oil production than Germany had ever achieved through conventional drilling, synthetic fuel production, and petroleum imports combined. The Americans had increased their oil production by more than Germany's entire fuel supply capacity. The implications for global warfare were staggering. American forces could conduct operations on a scale that was limited only by transportation capacity and strategic objectives, not by fuel availability or ammunition supplies. American military planners could design operations based on tactical and strategic considerations without worrying about logistical constraints that plagued other nations. Patterson continued his tour through the River Rouge complex, past steel mills that were producing armor plate, engine plants that were producing aircraft engines, and foundries that were producing artillery pieces. The facility represented vertical integration on a scale that no other industrial complex had ever achieved. Raw materials entered the complex at one end and finished military equipment emerged at the other end, with every stage of production controlled and optimized for maximum efficiency. The complex could produce a tank from iron or to finished vehicle in less time than most factories required just for final assembly. The vertical integration advantage extended beyond individual factories to encompass entire industrial regions. The Detroit area had become a massive military production complex that included dozens of factories, thousands of suppliers, and hundreds of thousands of workers. The region was producing military equipment in quantities that exceeded the total industrial output of entire European nations. But Detroit was only one of several American industrial regions that had been converted to military production. Los Angeles was producing aircraft and naval vessels. Pittsburgh was producing steel and artillery. Seattle was producing bombers and transport aircraft. Each region specialized in particular types of military equipment while maintaining the flexibility to shift production as strategic requirements changed. Mitchell interrupted Patterson's thoughts with production reports from other Ford facilities. Jim, figures from our other military production plants. The Rouge is producing Sherman tanks at a rate of 25 per day. Highland Park is producing aircraft engines at a rate of 40 per day. Chester is producing completed tank destroyers at a rate of 12 per day. Patterson studied the reports. Ford Motor Company alone was producing military equipment at a rate that exceeded the total military production of most nations. And Ford was only one of dozens of American corporations that had converted civilian production facilities to military production. General Motors was producing aircraft engines, artillery pieces, and machine guns. Chrysler was producing tanks and aircraft parts. Boeing was producing bombers. Douglas was producing transport aircraft and naval vessels. Each corporation had applied American mass production expertise to military equipment with results that foreign observers found difficult to believe. The statistical summary was overwhelming. American industry was producing military equipment in quantities that made individual battles strategically insignificant. American forces could afford to lose equipment in combat because replacement equipment was being produced faster than it could be lost. German forces, Japanese forces, and Italian forces were carefully conserving equipment because replacement equipment was difficult or impossible to obtain. American forces could employ equipment aggressively because abundant replacement equipment was available for any losses incurred in combat. The psychological impact of abundant equipment was as important as the tactical impact. American soldiers knew that they would have adequate supplies of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement equipment. Enemy soldiers knew that their supplies were limited and that equipment losses could not be easily replaced. Patterson walked to his office in the Ford Administrative Building and sat down to compile his monthly report for the War Production Board. The statistics he had collected told the story of industrial transformation that had turned American manufacturing capacity into the decisive factor in global warfare. American aircraft production in 1944 would exceed 120,000 aircraft. American shipbuilding would exceed 13 million tons. American tank production would exceed 30,000 vehicles. American artillery production would exceed 200,000 pieces. Each category of production exceeded the total military production capacity of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American industry was not just outproducing Axis industry, it was outproducing Axis industry by margins that made prolonged resistance mathematically impossible. But production statistics told only part of the story. The quality of American military equipment was improving as rapidly as the quantity. American aircraft were incorporating radar technology, improved communications equipment, and advanced armament systems. American tanks were receiving better armor, more powerful guns, and more reliable mechanical systems. American naval vessels were being equipped with superior fire control systems, advanced damage control equipment, and improved anti-aircraft defenses. American industry was not just producing more military equipment. It was producing better military equipment designed specifically for mass production and optimized for combat effectiveness. American military equipment was easier to manufacture, easier to maintain, and more effective in combat than comparable equipment produced by other nations. The combination of quantity and quality advantages made American industrial capacity the decisive factor in determining the outcome of the war. No amount of tactical excellence or fighting spirit could overcome the fundamental disparity in industrial output between American industry and Axis industry. Patterson finished his report and walked back through the production facility one more time. The sight of B-24 bombers rolling off the assembly line every 63 minutes represented the mathematical certainty of Allied victory. American industry was producing the tools of war faster than any enemy could destroy them. The terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare had reached its inevitable conclusion. Superior industrial capacity, properly organized and efficiently applied, would prevail over any opponent regardless of tactical skill or strategic brilliance. American industry had become the arsenal of democracy, and that arsenal was producing victory at a rate of 1 bomber every hour, 1 tank every 2 hours, and 1 Liberty ship every day. The mathematics were clear, unforgiving, and final. Oberst Gustav Brenner stood beside his staff car on the outskirts of Smolensk at dawn on August 22, 1941, studying fuel consumption reports that told a story of logistical disaster disguised as tactical success. As quartermaster of the 4th Panzer Group, Brenner was responsible for keeping German armored formations supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory. What he had discovered, 72 days into Operation Barbarossa, was that German logistics planning had been based on assumptions about Soviet resistance, Russian roads, and fuel consumption that bore no relationship to battlefield reality. The reports on his clipboard documented the arithmetic of logistical failure. German panzer divisions had advanced 800 kilometers into Soviet territory, achieving tactical successes that exceeded the most optimistic pre-war projections. But they had consumed fuel at rates that were nearly double the planned allocation, and they were now operating at the extreme limit of German supply capacity. Major Franz Dietrich, Brenner's chief logistics officer, approached carrying the overnight reports from fuel supply units scattered across the front. Her Oberst, fuel status reports from all divisions under 4th Panzer Group Command. Brenner looked up from his calculations. Major Dietrich had been compiling these reports since the beginning of the campaign, and each week the numbers grew more alarming. German fuel consumption was exceeding planned allocation by margins that threatened to immobilize the entire offensive. "What is our current fuel situation, Major?" Dietrich consulted his detailed records. "Current fuel stocks for the entire group total approximately 4,000 tons. Sir. Daily consumption is running approximately 800 tons. At current consumption rates, we have fuel for 5 days of operations." 5 days of operations. Brenner calculated the implications automatically. 5 days would allow perhaps 200 kilometers of advance, assuming minimal combat and favorable road conditions. But the next major Soviet defensive position was 400 kilometers ahead, and combat would certainly increase fuel consumption above current rates. The mathematics were inescapable. German armored formations had outrun their supply lines and were now operating in a logistical environment that could not sustain offensive operations much longer. The rapid advance that had been Germany's greatest tactical success was becoming Germany's greatest logistical liability. "What about fuel deliveries from rear area supply points, Major?" "Fuel convoys are currently delivering approximately 600 tons per day, sir. But convoy losses to partisan activity and mechanical breakdown are running approximately 15%. Effective fuel delivery is approximately 500 tons per day. 500 tons delivered, 800 tons consumed. The German fuel deficit was 300 tons per day and growing. At current rates, German fuel stocks would be exhausted within 1 week regardless of tactical success or strategic objectives. The fuel shortage was not a temporary problem that could be solved through better organization or greater effort. It was a fundamental consequence of German logistics planning that had failed to account for the realities of mechanized warfare in Soviet territory. German planners had assumed that Soviet roads would be adequate for motorized supply columns. Instead, German supply vehicles were struggling through mud, sand, and primitive tracks that tripled fuel consumption and reduced transportation efficiency. German planners had assumed that captured Soviet fuel stocks would supplement German supplies. Instead, Soviet forces had destroyed their fuel depots before retreating, leaving German forces dependent entirely on supplies transported from Germany. Most critically, German planners had assumed that the campaign would be concluded within 8 weeks, before fuel shortages could become critical. Instead, Soviet resistance was proving far more tenacious than anticipated, and the campaign was extending indefinitely into the future with no clear end in sight. Brenner walked along the column of German vehicles parked beside the road, noting the mechanical wear and fuel starvation that were becoming endemic throughout German forces. Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks were designed for European road networks and moderate ranges of operation. They were not designed for 1,000-kilometer advances across Russian steppe and forest terrain. Tank tracks designed for 5,000 kilometers of operation were wearing out after 3,000 kilometers on Russian roads. Tank engines designed for intermittent combat use were breaking down under continuous operation. Tank fuel systems designed for European supply networks were inadequate for supply lines that stretched across half a continent. The mechanical problems were compounded by fuel quality issues that German planners had not anticipated. German tanks and vehicles were designed to operate on high-octane gasoline refined from conventional petroleum. But German fuel supplies in the Soviet Union included large quantities of low-octane synthetic fuel that reduced engine performance and increased mechanical wear. Captured Soviet fuel was even worse. Soviet military fuel was often contaminated with water or impurities that caused engine problems in German vehicles. Soviet agricultural fuel was completely unsuitable for military vehicles and could cause permanent engine damage if used. The result was that German vehicles were consuming more fuel per kilometer while simultaneously suffering increased mechanical failure rates. Units that had been planned to operate for weeks without major maintenance were requiring extensive mechanical support after only days of operation. Brenner continued his inspection, noting the improvised fuel conservation measures that German units had adopted to stretch their limited supplies. Tank crews were shutting down their engines whenever possible to save fuel. Motorized infantry units were marching on foot to conserve vehicle fuel for combat operations. Artillery units were limiting their fire support to conserve fuel for towing guns and transporting ammunition. These conservation measures were tactically necessary but strategically dangerous. German forces were designed for rapid movement and aggressive tactics that required abundant fuel supplies. Fuel conservation measures reduced German tactical effectiveness and allowed Soviet forces to recover from initial defeats. The fuel shortage was affecting not only current operations but also strategic planning. German commanders were forced to choose between tactical objectives based on fuel availability rather than strategic importance. Promising tactical opportunities had to be abandoned because fuel shortages made exploitation impossible. Most critically, the fuel shortage meant that German strategy on the Eastern Front was becoming increasingly dependent on quick, decisive results. German forces could not sustain prolonged operations without fuel supplies that exceeded available transportation capacity. Major Dietrich returned with reports from Army Group Logistics Headquarters. Herr Oberst, latest intelligence on Soviet fuel production and stockpiles. Brenner studied the intelligence reports with professional interest. Understanding Soviet fuel capacity was essential for assessing the long-term prospects for German operations in the Soviet Union. Soviet fuel production is estimated at approximately 200,000 tons per month. Sir. Most production facilities are located east of the Urals, beyond the reach of German ground forces. Soviet fuel stockpiles in the western regions have been largely destroyed during their retreat. 200,000 tons per month. Brenner performed the mental calculation. Soviet fuel production was approximately 8 times German fuel consumption on the Eastern Front. Even accounting for Soviet military consumption and civilian allocation, the Soviets had access to fuel supplies that far exceeded German capacity to disrupt them. The strategic implications were sobering. Germany was fighting a fuel-limited campaign against an opponent with abundant fuel supplies. German forces had to achieve decisive results quickly before fuel shortages forced operational shutdown. Soviet forces could afford to trade space for time because their fuel supplies were secure and renewable. The disparity in fuel availability was compounded by disparities in transportation capacity. German supply lines stretched back to Germany through occupied territory where partisan activity was increasing. Soviet supply lines operated within Soviet territory using transportation networks that were constantly being repaired and expanded. German transportation capacity was limited by the number of trucks and railroad cars available for supply operations. Soviet transportation capacity was limited only by the capacity of their railroad network, which was vast and continuously expanding. The mathematical reality was that German forces on the Eastern Front were operating in an unsustainable logistical environment. They were consuming supplies faster than those supplies could be delivered while fighting an opponent with superior supply capacity and secure supply lines. Brenner walked back to his command vehicle and sat down to write his weekly logistics report for Army Group Headquarters. How could he explain to his superiors that German tactical success was creating strategic failure? How could he convey the implications of fuel shortages that would force German forces to halt offensive operations regardless of tactical opportunities? The irony was that German tactical performance had exceeded expectations. German forces had advanced farther and faster than planned, had destroyed more Soviet units than anticipated, had captured more territory than thought possible. But tactical success had worsened the logistics situation by extending German supply lines beyond sustainable limits. German planning had been based on achieving quick, decisive victory before logistics constraints could affect operations. But Soviet resistance was preventing quick, decisive victory. and logistics constraints were becoming more severe each day that operations continued. The fuel shortage on the Eastern Front was a microcosm of broader German strategic problems that would ultimately determine the outcome of the war. Germany was attempting to fight a global war with resources that were barely adequate for regional conflicts. German industrial capacity was insufficient to sustain prolonged operations on multiple fronts against opponents with superior resources. The Eastern Front fuel crisis was not an isolated logistics problem that could be solved through better planning or greater effort. It was a symptom of German strategic overextension that no amount of tactical success could cure. Brenner finished his report and walked back through the vehicle park one more time. German tanks and trucks represented the pinnacle of mechanical engineering and tactical design. They were superior to comparable Soviet vehicles in almost every measurable category. But they were operating in a logistical environment that made their technical superiority irrelevant. The terrible arithmetic of mechanized warfare was grinding inexorably toward a conclusion that no German quartermaster could alter. Superior tactics and equipment could not overcome fundamental disparities in resource availability and supply capacity. German forces on the Eastern Front were doomed not by Soviet tactical superiority, but by German logistical limitations that had been built into German strategy from the beginning of the campaign. The fuel shortage was not a temporary problem that could be solved. It was a permanent constraint that would force German strategy to adapt to realities that German planners had refused to acknowledge. The mathematics were clear, unforgiving, and final. German forces on the Eastern Front could not sustain offensive operations indefinitely. Soviet forces could sustain defensive operations as long as necessary. The outcome was predetermined by logistics arithmetic that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura stood in the operations room of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Combined Fleet Headquarters on March 10, 1943, studying fuel consumption reports that documented the mathematical impossibility of sustaining naval operations in the Central Pacific. As Chief Logistics Officer for Admiral Yamamoto's staff, Nakamura was responsible for calculating fuel requirements for Japanese naval operations across an ocean theater that stretched from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. What his calculations revealed was that Japan's fuel situation was deteriorating so rapidly that major naval operations would soon become impossible regardless of tactical success. The reports on his desk told the story of a navy running out of fuel while fighting an opponent with seemingly unlimited petroleum resources. Japanese naval fuel consumption had increased dramatically as operations intensified, while Japanese fuel production had remained virtually static due to resource constraints and transportation difficulties. Commander Kenji Sato, Nakamura's assistant, entered the operations room carrying the latest fuel status reports from major naval bases across the Pacific. Captain, current fuel stocks and consumption rates from all major installations. Nakamura looked up from his calculations. Commander Sato had been compiling these reports for 6 months. And each month the numbers became more alarming. Japanese fuel consumption was approaching Japanese fuel production capacity, leaving no margin for major operations or strategic reserves. What is our current fuel situation across all theater operations? Commander. Sato consulted his detailed records. Total naval fuel stocks in the Pacific Theater currently total 230,000 tons. Sir. Monthly consumption is running approximately 180,000 tons. Current stocks represent approximately 5 weeks of normal operations. 5 weeks of operations. Nakamura calculated the implications immediately. Normal operations included routine patrols, training flights, and logistics movements. Major combat operations would double or triple fuel consumption, reducing operational endurance to perhaps 2 weeks. But the most alarming aspect of the fuel situation was not current stocks but future supply. Japanese fuel production was barely sufficient to meet current consumption, and any increase in operational tempo would create immediate shortages throughout the fleet. What about fuel deliveries from domestic production and captured territories? Commander. Fuel deliveries from domestic sources are running approximately 90,000 tons per month. Sir. Deliveries from the East Indies are running approximately 60,000 tons per month. Total fuel supply is 150,000 tons per month. 150,000 tons supplied, 180,000 tons consumed. Japan was operating with a fuel deficit of 30,000 tons per month, a deficit that was being covered by drawing down strategic reserves that could not be replaced. The mathematics of Japanese fuel supply were inexorably moving toward complete logistical collapse. At current consumption rates and supply levels, Japanese naval fuel stocks would be exhausted within 6 months. Major naval operations would become impossible within 3 months. The fuel shortage was not a temporary problem that could be solved through better logistics or greater efficiency. It was a fundamental consequence of Japanese strategic planning that had failed to account for the realities of prolonged naval warfare across the Pacific Ocean. Japanese planners had assumed that control of the East Indies oil fields would provide adequate fuel supplies for naval operations. Instead, transporting fuel from the East Indies to Japanese naval bases required tanker capacity that was being destroyed by American submarines faster than it could be replaced. Japanese tanker losses in the first year of the war had exceeded 50% of the total tanker fleet. Remaining tankers were operating under increasingly dangerous conditions as American submarine activity intensified. Fuel deliveries from the East Indies were becoming irregular and unreliable. Most critically, Japanese planners had assumed that American naval operations would be limited by the same fuel constraints that affected Japanese operations. Instead, American forces appeared to have unlimited fuel supplies and were conducting operations on a scale that Japan could not match. Nakamura walked to the strategic planning area where charts showed the disposition of Japanese naval forces across the Pacific. The geographic scale of operations was itself a major factor in fuel consumption. Japanese naval bases were scattered across thousands of kilometers of ocean, requiring constant fuel shipments to maintain operational readiness. Each major naval base required approximately 5,000 tons of fuel per month for routine operations. Japan was attempting to maintain operational bases from the Kuriles to the Solomons, a distance of more than 5,000 kilometers. The fuel required just for logistics operations consumed a substantial portion of total Japanese fuel production. American naval bases, by contrast, were supplied through secure supply lines that did not face submarine attack or long-distance transportation requirements. American Pacific Fleet bases in Hawaii and California had direct access to American petroleum production that exceeded Japanese fuel production by factors of 10 or more. The disparity in fuel supply capacity was compounded by disparities in fuel consumption efficiency. Japanese naval vessels had been designed for operations in the Western Pacific with relatively short supply lines. They were not optimized for the extended range operations that Pacific warfare required. Japanese aircraft carriers consumed approximately 2,000 tons of fuel per month during active operations. Japanese battleships consumed approximately 3,000 tons per month. A typical Japanese naval task force consumed more fuel in 1 month of operations than some Japanese naval bases received in 3 months. American naval vessels were designed for global operations with fuel consumption characteristics optimized for long-range missions. American carriers had greater fuel capacity and more efficient propulsion systems than Japanese carriers. American naval task forces could operate for longer periods without refueling than comparable Japanese formations. The result was that Japanese naval operations were becoming increasingly constrained by fuel availability, while American operations appeared to be unlimited by fuel considerations. Japanese commanders had to plan operations based on fuel allocation rather than tactical requirements. American commanders could plan operations based on strategic objectives without significant fuel constraints. Nakamura continued his analysis of Pacific theater fuel logistics, noting the transportation bottlenecks that were strangling Japanese supply operations. Japanese fuel had to be transported by tanker from production areas to forward naval bases, a journey that could take several weeks and was increasingly dangerous due to American submarine activity. The tanker transportation system was also extremely inefficient. Each tanker could carry approximately 10,000 tons of fuel, but the round-trip journey from Japan to forward bases in the Central Pacific took approximately 1 month. A fleet of 30 tankers could deliver approximately 300,000 tons of fuel per month, assuming no losses to enemy action. But Japan had fewer than 20 operational tankers remaining, and those tankers were operating under conditions that made regular schedules impossible. Fuel deliveries to forward bases were becoming irregular and unpredictable, forcing Japanese commanders to maintain larger fuel reserves and limiting their operational flexibility. Commander Sato returned with intelligence reports on American fuel operations. Captain, latest estimates of American fuel production and supply capacity in the Pacific Theater. Nakamura studied the intelligence reports with professional interest and growing alarm. American fuel operations in the Pacific were on a scale that made Japanese operations seem insignificant by comparison. American petroleum production is estimated at 4.7 million barrels per day, sir. American tanker construction is proceeding at a rate of approximately 50 vessels per year. American fuel supply operations in the Pacific appear to be unlimited by production or transportation constraints, for 0.7 million barrels per day. Nakamura converted the figure to more familiar units. Approximately 750,000 tons per day, or 22.5 million tons per month. American petroleum production in 1 month exceeded Japanese total fuel production capacity for an entire year. The disparity was so vast that it called into question the entire strategic basis for Japanese naval operations in the Pacific. Japan was fighting a fuel-limited campaign against an opponent with unlimited fuel resources. Mathematical victory was impossible under such conditions. The intelligence reports also revealed that American tanker construction was proceeding at rates that made Japanese tanker losses strategically insignificant. Japan was sinking American tankers faster than any naval force in history, but American shipyards were building replacement tankers faster than Japan could sink them. American tanker construction capacity exceeded Japanese tanker construction capacity by ratios of 50 to 1 or more. Japan could not build tankers fast enough to replace combat losses, while America could build tankers fast enough to expand their tanker fleet even while absorbing heavy combat losses. The mathematical implications were devastating. Japanese naval strategy was based on the assumption that disrupting American supply lines would force American withdrawal from the Western Pacific. But American supply capacity was so vast that Japanese attacks on American supply lines had no measurable strategic effect. Nakamura walked to his desk and began preparing his monthly fuel analysis for Admiral Yamamoto's staff. The statistics he had compiled painted a picture of inevitable strategic defeat unless Japanese strategy could be fundamentally altered to account for Japanese fuel limitations. Current Japanese fuel consumption was unsustainable at current production and supply levels. Japanese naval operations would have to be scaled back dramatically within 3 months or fuel stocks would be exhausted. Major combat operations would consume fuel at rates that would force Japanese forces to withdraw from advanced positions within weeks. Most critically, Japanese fuel production capacity could not be increased significantly without resources and equipment that were not available. Japanese synthetic fuel plants were operating at maximum capacity with outdated equipment and insufficient raw materials. Japanese access to East Indies petroleum was being strangled by American submarine operations that were intensifying each month. The fuel crisis was not a logistics problem that could be solved through better planning or operational efficiency. It was a strategic problem that required fundamental revision of Japanese war aims and operational concepts. Japan could not sustain naval operations on the scale required for offensive operations in the Central Pacific. Japanese naval strategy would have to shift to defensive operations designed to conserve fuel while inflicting maximum casualties on American forces. But defensive operations would merely delay inevitable defeat unless Japanese fuel production could be increased or American fuel supplies could be disrupted significantly. Neither objective appeared achievable with available Japanese resources and capabilities. Nakamura finished his analysis and walked to Admiral Yamamoto's office to deliver his report. The mathematics of Pacific naval warfare were clear, unforgiving, and final. Japan's fuel situation made prolonged naval operations impossible regardless of tactical success or strategic brilliance. The combined fleet was running out of fuel while fighting an opponent with unlimited fuel resources. The outcome was predetermined by industrial and resource disparities that no amount of tactical excellence could overcome. Admiral Yamamoto studied Nakamura's fuel analysis with the same grim expression that would later appear on Oberst von Manstein's face in that Belgian fuel depot. The mathematics were clear to anyone who understood the logistical requirements of modern naval warfare. Japan was doomed not by inferior tactics or insufficient fighting spirit, but by the terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare between opponents with vastly different resource capacities. The fuel shortage was not a problem to be solved, but a constraint that would determine the ultimate outcome of the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy, like the German Army and the Italian Navy, had discovered that modern warfare was not decided by courage and tactical skill but by industrial capacity and resource availability. The mathematics were brutal, unforgiving, and final. Professor William Harrison sat in his office at the War Production Board in Washington, D.C. on February 28, 1945, compiling the statistical analysis that would document the mathematical certainty of Allied victory in World War II. As the board's chief statistician, Harrison had spent 3 years collecting production data, consumption figures, and resource allocation statistics from every major combatant nation. The numbers he had assembled told the story of industrial warfare with mathematical precision that left no room for speculation or optimistic interpretation. The report on his desk, classified top secret and destined for President Roosevelt's personal review, contained the statistical evidence that the war had been decided not on battlefields but in factories, not by tactical brilliance but by industrial capacity. Dr. Margaret Collins, Harrison's chief research assistant, entered the office carrying the final production statistics for 1944. Professor, the completed analysis of Axis versus Allied production capacity for the final year of data. Harrison looked up from his calculations. Dr. Collins had been compiling these statistics for 2 years, and each monthly report had shown the gap between Allied and Axis production widening to margins that made continued Axis resistance mathematically impossible. What are the final numbers for 1944 production? Dr. Collins. Collins consulted her carefully prepared statistical summary. Combined Allied aircraft production totaled 167,000 aircraft in 1944, sir. Combined Axis aircraft production totaled 39,000 aircraft. Allied production exceeded Axis production by a ratio of 4.3 to 1 inch. 4.3 to 1. Harrison noted the figure in his summary report. Aircraft production ratios had increased steadily throughout the war as Allied production capacity expanded while Axis production capacity remained static or declined due to strategic bombing and resource shortages. What about naval production, Dr. Collins? Allied naval production in 1944 totaled 2.8 million tons displacement, sir. Axis naval production totaled approximately 300,000 tons. Allied production exceeded Axis production by a ratio of 9.3 to 1 inch. 9.3 to 1. The naval production disparity was even more pronounced than aircraft production disparities. Allied shipyards, led by American facilities, were launching warships faster than Axis forces could sink them while simultaneously building merchant vessels to replace combat losses and expand logistics capacity. But the most devastating comparison was industrial production capacity measured in terms of raw materials and energy consumption. These statistics revealed the fundamental resource disparities that determined the outcome of industrial warfare. Dr. Collins, what are our final figures for steel production, petroleum production, and electrical generation capacity? Collins turned to the section of her report that documented raw materials and energy production. These statistics were the most closely guarded secrets of wartime analysis because they revealed the true industrial capacity of each combatant nation. Allied steel production in 1944 totaled 97 million tons, sir. Axis steel production totaled approximately 26 million tons. Allied petroleum production totaled 712 million barrels. Axis petroleum production totaled 38 million barrels, 97 million tons versus 26 million tons of steel production. 712 million barrels versus 38 million barrels of petroleum production. The resource disparities were so vast that they made continued Axis resistance strategically meaningless regardless of tactical performance. Harrison studied the statistical summary that documented Allied industrial superiority in every measurable category. Aircraft production, naval construction, tank manufacturing, artillery production, small arms production, ammunition production, transportation equipment, communications equipment, radar technology, medical supplies. In every category, Allied production exceeded Axis production by margins of 3 to 1 or greater. But raw production statistics told only part of the story. The quality of Allied military equipment was also improving at rates that Axis production could not match. American aircraft in 1944 were superior to American aircraft in 1941 in every measurable category. British radar technology in 1944 was superior to British radar technology in 1941 by factors that made earlier systems obsolete. Axis military equipment, by contrast, was declining in quality as resource shortages forced the use of substitute materials and simplified designs. German aircraft in 1944 were inferior to German aircraft in 1941 due to material shortages and production compromises. Japanese naval vessels completed in 1944 were inferior to Japanese naval vessels completed in 1941 due to steel shortages and construction shortcuts. The combination of quantitative and qualitative advantages made Allied victory mathematically certain regardless of battlefield performance. Allied forces were better equipped with superior weapons produced in greater quantities than Axis forces could match or counter. Dr. Collins provided Harrison with the statistical analysis of military manpower and training that documented Allied advantages in human resources as well as material resources. Allied military manpower in 1944 totaled approximately 37 million personnel under arms. Sir. Axis military manpower totaled approximately 22 million personnel. But the more significant disparity is in training and equipment standards. 37 million versus 22 million military personnel represented a substantial numerical advantage. But the more important factor was the quality of training and equipment provided to those personnel. Allied military personnel were receiving longer and more comprehensive training than Axis personnel due to resource availability and institutional capacity. American pilot training programs required 350 hours of flight time before assignment to combat units. German pilot training programs had been reduced to 100 hours due to fuel shortages. British tank crews received 6 months of training before deployment. German tank crews were receiving 6 weeks of training due to equipment shortages and operational requirements. The training disparity was compounded by equipment availability. Allied military personnel were equipped with superior weapons, better communications equipment, improved medical support, and more reliable logistics support than Axis personnel. Allied casualty rates were lower than Axis casualty rates not only due to superior tactics but also due to superior equipment and support. Harrison continued his statistical analysis by examining logistics and supply chain capacity. These statistics were particularly revealing because they documented the industrial infrastructure that supported military operations rather than just the military equipment itself. Allied logistics capacity exceeded Axis logistics capacity by margins even greater than combat equipment production disparities. American truck production in 1944 totaled 800,000 vehicles. German truck production totaled 60,000 vehicles. American railroad capacity was sufficient to transport military equipment across continental distances without affecting civilian transportation. German railroad capacity was stretched beyond sustainable limits and was declining due to strategic bombing and maintenance shortages. The logistics disparities had direct impact on combat effectiveness. Allied forces could be supplied with abundant ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and replacement equipment regardless of operational distance from supply bases. Axis forces were chronically short of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts even when operating close to supply sources. Allied forces could conduct operations at maximum intensity for extended periods because their logistics systems could support sustained operations. Axis forces had to limit operational intensity to conserve supplies and equipment that could not be replaced quickly. The statistical evidence was overwhelming and mathematically decisive. Allied industrial capacity exceeded Axis industrial capacity by margins that made continued Axis resistance militarily meaningless. The war had been decided by industrial production ratios that no amount of tactical skill or strategic brilliance could overcome. Harrison walked to the window of his office and looked out over Washington, D.C., where government buildings and defense contractors were coordinating the largest industrial mobilization in human history. The scale of American war production was beyond the comprehension of foreign observers who had not witnessed the transformation of American industry. American aircraft factories were producing more military aircraft in 1 month than most nations produced in 1 year. American shipyards were launching more naval vessels in 1 week than most nations launched in 1 month. American industrial capacity had been converted to military production with efficiency and speed that exceeded the most optimistic pre-war projections. But American production was only part of the Allied industrial advantage. British production had also increased dramatically, particularly in areas such as radar technology, naval architecture, and precision manufacturing. Soviet production had recovered from initial German attacks and was producing tanks, artillery, and small arms in quantities that exceeded German production despite the loss of major industrial regions. The combined Allied industrial capacity represented a concentration of productive resources that no coalition of opposing nations could match. The Axis powers were attempting to fight industrial warfare with industrial resources that were insufficient for the scale of operations required. Dr. Collins completed her statistical summary and presented Harrison with the final analysis that would be included in the report to President Roosevelt. Professor, the mathematical conclusion is unambiguous. Allied victory is guaranteed by industrial production ratios that cannot be altered by battlefield performance. Axis resistance will continue to decline as resource shortages worsen and production capacity is degraded by strategic bombing. Harrison reviewed the statistical summary one final time before incorporating it into his report. The numbers were clear, unforgiving, and mathematically decisive. World War II had been decided not by battlefield tactics but by factory production schedules. The terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare had reached its inevitable conclusion. Superior industrial capacity, properly organized and efficiently applied, had prevailed over inferior industrial capacity regardless of tactical performance or strategic innovation. The statistical analysis of World War II would serve as a permanent record of the mathematical laws that govern modern warfare between industrialized nations. Superior production capacity would always prevail over superior tactics when the production disparities were as vast as those that characterized World War II. Harrison completed his report and prepared it for transmission to the White House. The statistical evidence was overwhelming. The war had been won not by soldiers and generals, but by workers and engineers who had transformed industrial capacity into military superiority that no opponent could match. The mathematics of victory were brutal, elegant, and final. Oberst Friedrich von Manstein returned to his headquarters near St. Vith on December 23, 1944, carrying with him not just the fuel captured from the American depot but also the mathematical certainty of German defeat. The 50,000 gallons of gasoline that had seemed like salvation 2 days earlier now felt like evidence in a criminal case, proof of American industrial capacity so vast that German victory had never been mathematically possible. He sat at his field desk and opened the leather-bound notebook that had become his private record of the arithmetic of defeat. The calculations he had been making since that morning in the fuel depot had revealed the mathematical structure underlying the collapse of the Third Reich. The numbers told a story more devastating than any battlefield defeat, more final than any strategic reversal. American oil production, 4.7 million barrels per day. German synthetic fuel production, 92,000 barrels per day. American advantage, 51-1. American aircraft production, 1944, 120,000 aircraft. German aircraft production, 1944, 25,000 aircraft. American advantage, 4.8-1. American steel production, 1944, 97 million tons. German steel production, 1944, 26 million tons. American advantage, 3.7-1. The ratios were mathematically decisive in every category of industrial production that determined the outcome of modern warfare. Germany was not losing the war gradually through accumulated tactical defeats. Germany had lost the war immediately upon choosing to fight opponents with industrial capacity that Germany could never match. The fuel depot had revealed the mathematical structure of Germany's doom. The 50,000 gallons that his division had captured represented less than 2 minutes of American daily oil production. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in one tactical withdrawal than Germany could produce in 1 month of maximum effort. But the mathematics extended beyond simple production comparisons. The Americans were not just outproducing Germany. They were improving their production methods while simultaneously scaling up production volume. American factories were becoming more efficient while German factories were becoming less efficient due to resource shortages and strategic bombing. American industrial learning was proceeding at rates that made German technical advantages temporary and ultimately irrelevant. American aircraft in 1944 were superior to American aircraft in 1941. American tanks in 1944 were superior to American tanks in 1941. American industrial techniques in 1944 were superior to American industrial techniques in 1941. German technical advantages, by contrast, were being eroded by resource limitations that prevented the full exploitation of German engineering capabilities. German aircraft designs in 1944 were compromised by material shortages. German tank production in 1944 was limited by steel allocation. German industrial techniques in 1944 were constrained by fuel shortages and labor limitations. The result was that American military effectiveness was improving while German military effectiveness was declining, creating tactical disparities that compounded the strategic disparities created by industrial production ratios. Von Manstein closed his notebook and walked outside into the Belgian winter. Around him, the remnants of the Ardennes offensive were grinding to a halt as German units ran out of fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. The great offensive that was supposed to change the course of the war was ending not in dramatic battlefield defeat but in logistical exhaustion. The pattern was familiar because von Manstein had seen it repeated on every front where German forces operated. Initial tactical success followed by logistical breakdown followed by strategic withdrawal followed by defensive positions that could not be held due to resource limitations. The Eastern Front had followed the same pattern. North Africa had followed the same pattern. Italy was following the same pattern. The Atlantic Wall had followed the same pattern. German strategy had achieved tactical successes that were strategically meaningless because German industrial capacity could not sustain the logistics requirements of modern warfare on a global scale. The Ardennes offensive would be remembered as Hitler's last gamble, but von Manstein knew that it had never been a gamble at all. It had been a mathematical impossibility disguised as a military operation. Germany did not have the fuel to sustain offensive operations to Antwerp. Germany did not have the transportation capacity to supply forces that achieved breakthrough. Germany did not have the production capacity to replace equipment losses that would be incurred during extended operations. The offensive had been authorized not because German planners believed it could succeed, but because German strategy had no other options available. Germany had to attempt offensive operations because defensive operations would lead to inevitable defeat through resource attrition. But offensive operations were also leading to inevitable defeat through resource attrition at accelerated rates. Von Manstein understood that he was witnessing the end of German strategic options. Germany could no longer sustain offensive operations due to resource limitations. Germany could no longer sustain defensive operations due to production disparities. Germany could no longer negotiate from a position of strength because German weakness was becoming apparent to all observers. The mathematics of industrial warfare had reduced German strategy to a choice between rapid defeat through resource exhaustion or slow defeat through production attrition. The outcome was predetermined. Only the timeline remained uncertain. The fuel depot had revealed not just American abundance but also German mathematical illiteracy. German strategic planning had consistently failed to account for the quantitative realities of industrial warfare. German planners had based strategy on qualitative assumptions about German superiority that were contradicted by quantitative evidence about resource limitations. German tactical excellence was real and measurable. German technical innovation was real and measurable. German fighting spirit was real and measurable. But all of these qualitative advantages were insufficient to overcome quantitative disparities in industrial production that favored Germany's opponents by ratios of 3 to 1 or greater in every critical category. The mathematics were clear, unforgiving, and final. Germany had committed itself to a war that Germany could not afford to fight against opponents whose industrial capacity Germany could not match. The result was predetermined by arithmetic that no amount of tactical brilliance could alter.